For the longest time, I struggled with using the simplistic anime shading style, since it's very minimal but somehow conveys lots of detail. In this video, I show you step by step how to color hair, skin, and clothes in a simple way. I've also placed timestamps below for you to easily navigate through the different sections. Now we'll begin with basics of color. So basically, tone refers to the darkness and brightness of a color, namely how much it's mixed with black and white. Often, beginners use tone to select their highlight and shadow colors to make a palette that looks like this. So I take a color and I move it to the dark side and create shadows like this, my shading color. Now, using this method with like only tone to create shadow colors is very unrecommended because it makes it look quite muddy and brownish, which is not what we want in our artworks. Now, on the other hand is saturation. A fully saturated color is a color in its purest form. Think of it like a paint that's not been mixed with black, white, or any colors. When saturation is very high, it can be very difficult to look at the color itself, or when it's mixed with a variety of highly saturated colors. So when developing a color palette, it's very important to take saturation into place so that you don't oversaturate everything that you create. When it comes to a shadow palette created using only saturation, which is another beginner's mistake, it can look like this. So I take my color that I chose, I move it down to the saturation, and then another time, and it does kind of create a shadow palette, but it's so bright it doesn't properly convey darkness. So then now you might be wondering, Mars, then how do I really make a good shading palette? Well, now here's where the magic happens. If you use both saturation and tone together, the palette is neither muddy nor overstimulating, giving you a palette like this. Let's take this orangish color. Let's take this orangish color and give it a bit of darkness, but drag it over to have a bit more saturation. Once again, do the same thing. As you can see, this color palette is a lot nicer to look at compared to the other two. Let's just do another comparison where I only use saturation. As you can see, it's a lot brighter in the oversaturation side. But for a lot of artists, this is simply not enough. A way to make the color palette for your shadows pop is to use hues. Hues are the different warm and cool colors you see on the color wheel. So as you can see, this side is a lot warmer and this side is a lot cooler. Now let's try to take this color and add a change of hue. What I do is slightly veer the color wheel to a pinkish side for this kind of orangish color. Then I take the color and slightly saturate it and darken it at the same time. I do the same thing again and slightly veer the color to a pinkish side again. Wait, let me make that just a little bit darker. And voila, there it is. It's a palette that makes your colors darker, but also adds a bit of pop of color by changing the hue slightly, and it makes a big difference. Now, there's one more thing to do. I'll color pick this, and I want to add a highlight color. So what I'd do is I'd veer it to the opposite side of the shadow color and make the hue more orangish and add a bit of light to it. And it creates this lovely light color that isn't too over the top or saturated, and now it's really pretty. So we'll veer it slightly to the yellowish hue and give it a lighter brightness of tone, and there we go, we have our highlights. Now it's complete, but how do we actually shade our drawing after developing our highlight and shadow palette? For this tutorial, I prepared a couple of illustrations to help demonstrate how I cel shade in an anime style. Since eyes vary stylistically in anime drawings, I've decided to shade them already. As you can see, I've also added where the light source is coming from the top left, it helps our shadows stay consistent and make sense. First off, we'll start with skin. I'll shade 2 different skin tones so that we could have more covered. So first off, I want to just shade the eye whites quickly. What I do is I typically go down to a more purple or blue color and go down like this. Create a clipping mask on top and create a hard shadow. It's better than a gray because it helps it be less muddy and more pop of color. Just adds a bit of three-dimensionality to the piece. Now I'll add a clipping mask on top of the skin and I'll color pick it and choose a pinkish tone, slightly make it a bit darker, and add a bit of blush to just liven up the skin and give it a bit more warmth and life to it. I don't add too much blush, just a little bit so that it just adds a pop of color, and I add the same color to her lips. And I usually do this to my female characters and not so much my male characters. So there we go, it's a bit of a soft touch to the character. Then I use my hard pen again, reselect the skin color, go down to a more reddish hue, and make the color a bit darker. Then I'll just make it a little bit darker again. Then I put shadows under the bangs and under wherever a shadow might fall, which typically be under where things overlap. Typically, shadows are larger when something is at a greater distance. So the chin is at a greater distance from the neck, so I create a larger shadow underneath it. So there we go. I'll be adding a bit of a shadow, a lighter shadow for the nose, and slightly blurring it, I like to do sometimes. I'll make it a bit more subtle. Slightly blurring it. There we go. So that's how it looks like so far. And we have to take into account that the lighting situation looks like that. So the jaw is a bit darkened and curved since the cheeks are curved, so the shadow must be curved as well. We're adding some more shadows where things overlap, like the clothes and the armpits. As you can see, cell shading is very simplistic. As shown in anime, creates a very nice clean look, but the color of the shadow is bold enough that it's pleasing to the eye. I usually add a bit of a dent here because there's a muscle, the bicep creates a bit of a curve. And the shadows here are much smaller since the skin and the clothes are touching directly. So that's a basic application of the shadows. Now we'll go over to the other parts. What I'll also do is I'll add a touch of blush where the breasts are, so that there's a bit of roundness to it. Creates just a touch of three-dimensionality again. Just a bit of shadows down here, but the rest of the shadows are where the opposite of the light source is. Again, taking into account the muscles, there would be a shadow there. Sometimes I even color full fingers when I'm shading hands. With these sort of hands, I also color in a pinkish tone to the nails. Usually I do this with my girls because it just works quite well. Another pink tone to the nails. This time it's shadows. The leg closest to the sun will have a lot less shading because there's so much sun exposure on it. I usually like to just do a bit of a lighter shading tone here and blur it slightly since the knees protrude a bit, so they're curved outward. And usually when things are airbrushed, they indicate that it's a curve. There'll be a lot more shading on since the sun is not hitting it as much, or the light source. And you can always erase your mistakes because it's on a clipping mask. I don't want it to be too shaded, but also not too light. And slightly make it melt in. You could also do this with the other knee. Slightly make it melt in so that it's more soft. When I color my skin, I also add to the inside of the shadows. So what I do is I lower the opacity of my brush and just add faint touches of a bit of purplish, pinkish colors. And this really separates things. And sometimes you can blur it a little bit in, create a bit of a nice gradient. And this really just separates the colors and makes them vibrant and very nice to look at. And it adds a bit of lighting to the shadow. So it's good not to overdo it. So some parts will be a lot more subtle. Some parts will have a lot more. There we go. The end bits here. Okay, there we go. So here I want to also slightly push back the shadow, just because this is a bit too straight and the line of the shadow should follow the line of the line art. Okay, so those are the shadows. They're quite harsh because of how harsh the sunlight itself is. So let's just blend this part a little and smooth it over. There we go. I also like to add the nostril, but this is a very stylistic choice. And let's not forget the eyelids. What I like to do is I like to lower the opacity of my brush and add the two ends of the eyelid so that the middle part creates a bit of a highlight. And then I like to create a clipping mask, and I put a bit of a yellowish white tone on a higher opacity of my brush and add in a bit of light, especially within the crevice of the boobs, since typically because there is sunlight on that side, there's a bit more light on this. There's a bit of light on the nose, on the mouth, and on the cheek. Sometimes I add a bit of light on the ends of the blush, and I'll add a bit more shadow that's a bit lighter to the boobs here. And some areas you may choose to add a bit of a circlish highlight. The knees have a bit of a circlish highlight themselves. Sometimes the edge of the knees, where the light is facing, will have a bit of a blurred highlight. So there we go, it's a bit three-dimensional. Though I feel like in this part of the bicep, it might need a bit more of a curved highlight that blurs a little bit, and on the collarbones. And that's how the skin would look like. Now I'll do the same thing, but for a darker skin tone. Let's add the blush. For a darker skin tone, you still go down to the red of the color wheel, go for a dark-ish color. Once again, airbrush it in, and the lips. Let's color pick the skin again. Go for a reddish color, as I usually like to do, or a purplish color. Fits really well with skin tones as well. Make it a bit darker, just so that it could pop. And in the same places as usual. Now that I've quickly shaded the skin, I'll go over how I highlight the skin. So I color pick the skin again and go to a more orange side slightly and go up to the highlight slightly as well. Now I try to make it a bit more saturated. So I try to go to more saturated side of the orange and then color the highlight in on the lips and the nose. This is a more intense sort of highlight, but I could always make it a bit softer and subtle if I wanted to. Then again, here, lightly blur it, make the opacity a bit lower. I also try to add a bit of color to the shadow of the skin as always, and sometimes adding a bit of blue also creates a lot of diversity in the skin tone, which makes it nice and colorful. Adding purple to this makes it look very nice. A bit of purplish color mixed in creates a very 3D effect. When the opacity is lowered, sometimes you don't need to airbrush it because it blends quite nicely. There we go. Here I feel like it's not smooth enough. I'm gonna add a bit of airbrush. Just make it a lot more subtle. Even here. But sometimes the pop of the cell shading makes it stand out a lot. So let's add a bit of a circle. And there we go. That's it for the skin tone section. Now onto the hair. So we begin again by color picking and selecting a light tone, and I want this to be a bit of an orangish hue. And I select my airbrush and slightly add a bit of an airbrush touch to the hair in the direction of the light source. This creates a bit of a 3D look, even though it's very subtle. Then I color pick the original color again, create another clipping mask, and go down to the pinkish purplish color and make it a bit darker, and add some streaks to my hair in the direction of the line art. So I do this and I usually expand upon the line art so that the hair looks like it's flowing down in triangular streaks. So I begin with these really darkish tones, and behind the chin is usually a lot darker. So I create a large shadow and then add smaller streaks of hair to break it up, especially at the bangs, since bangs are actually quite separated. Taking into account the light source, the shadows come from this side. And sometimes I color pick the top, make it slightly darker with a reddish tone again, a reddish pinkish tone, and add some dark shadows that are slightly lighter than the previous so that the top meets the bottom. I usually go completely cell shading mode with a lack of blurring, and sometimes I color pick again at the bottom but make it a lighter shadow. It's a little bit more detailed but still simple in a way. It's very visually pleasing. And now is a fun part where we add some colors into the hair. So for this I'll add a bit of a bluish color, lower the opacity, and implement this color, which is turned a bit purplish, to the very inner parts of the shadow. It creates a bit of separation and makes it very visually pleasing. And then within the shadow, create a dark color, create more streaks within the shadow. And then we need to add the highlights of the hair. What I typically do is I color select the hair. I'll go to the orangish hues and select a partly saturated and partly light color. And I usually have this on 100% opacity on a separate clipping mask layer, and I simply create circles. And you have to be quite selective where you place these sort of circles, but they go alongside the lines. And then I erase it, the bottom and the top, in a circular motion to create these nice anime style highlights that indicate that the hair is shiny and healthy. And sometimes I add streaks of highlights towards the end of the hair. And unless you're going for a very poppy look, you can also lower the opacity just to soften it a little bit. And there we go, that's it for the hair. Now finally we're up to the clothes. So it's important to remember that this is a very basic tutorial. So if you want to know how to do wrinkles or how to draw folds, it's very important to look at studies using apps such as YouTube or Pinterest, and just looking at photos and replicating what you see. For this tutorial, I'm focusing on the colors. So for a white shirt like this, I typically go for a shadow color that's very similar to a sort of desaturated blue. This is typically done in anime. They use a very desaturated blue since it's a lot nicer to look at than a grayish color. So what I do is I make a curved line beneath the boobs or an upward curve depending on the type of shape you're going for. You could go for both like this or like this. So this is a big shadow shape, very simplistic. So in order to break down the clothes a little bit more, I color pick the shadow and create a darker, slightly more purplish blue and draw in some of the wrinkles. I typically try not to add wrinkles in my line art too much so that I could convey it more flowingly in my coloring, since coloring is a lot more fluid and redeemable. Over here, bit of a curve, and over here as well. Let's readjust the wrinkles. Usually they're sort of like triangular shapes. This line art here is bothering me a little bit, so I'll just slightly adjust it. Since it was very constraining, I removed the line art and flatten this color slightly so that everything's smoother. Create a shadow here since it dips in because of the crevice of the boobs. You can take into account the shape that the clothes are being molded by. Some of the base color will return within the shadow to show that parts of the wrinkles have light within it to indicate more of a fold. And what I like to do is I like to take the base color and use the airbrush tool to slightly soften the clothes. And this just makes it a lot smoother and cleaner. Let's do this again with the shorts. I take a color, adjust the hue and the shadow, apply where I believe the wrinkles would be. And from this side, the shadows are overwhelmingly the opposite side of the light source. There we go. I'll add a bit of a crease at the top to indicate a bit of a sewing line. Some shadows are implemented, and sometimes smaller shadows are implemented as well to indicate more folds and creases. Now I take some of this base color and further imply that there are wrinkles in the clothing. And since this is a very dark color, it would be very nice to implement some pops of color within the darkness. So I'm going to implement some purple, lower the opacity slightly, and add a bit of a color touch to the shadows and blend them in slightly. This just makes it feel a bit 3D. And of course the crevice needs a bit of lightening here, so it indicates that it still remains even past the shadow. Just slightly adjusting it again. And then adding the lighting, since this is a very dark color. When adding lighting, I go the opposite side of the color wheel, add a bit of a blue touch to the gray. It's not completely gray, so that it remains colorful but not oversaturated. Implementing some wrinkles within the highlights. There we go, that's it for the shorts. Just slightly adjust the shadows as you see fit. And it's optional, but you can airbrush in the highlights slightly. Now, the final thing is the socks, which I added so I don't have to draw feet. For the socks, again, it's a mixture of white and pink. Let's start with the white. Add a bit of a grayish blue. This one can be quite simple. There's not many wrinkles in a sock. Add some crevices with the white. Since this is an off-white, I can add a bit of a white highlight. There we go. A bit of a curve since the leg is curved downwards. It's not a completely straight line. And I'll slightly add a bit of a light blue within and a tealish tint within the shadow, just to create some lightness on the sock. And now for the pink, implement a bit of a either purple or warm touch. I will go for a warm reddish shadow on the pink. This is quite an intense shadow. There we go. Implement a bit of a purplish tint within the shadow, just to adjust the colors slightly. And since it's a bit more curved, I will add a bit of a slight blur and a touch of a highlight towards the more purplish side, although it's not too shiny, so the highlight should be a bit more subtle. And that's it. This is a completed product of my cel shading tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in more art-related videos, please consider subscribing to become a new flower bud in my garden.